I'm standing in a tiny hut at the edge of the frozen valley, and the wind outside sounds like it's trying to erase the world. It scratches against the walls like claws searching for a way in. The fire, my only companion, gasps for breath. A creature made of light and will, fighting extinction one spark at a time. I press a glowing stone to my baby's chest so his skin won't turn blue before sunrise. The warmth trembles under my fingers, almost alive. I whisper the old words. In through the nose, out through the heart. The rhythm slows my breathing, steadies my hands. The frost presses against the window like a jealous god, and for a moment, I wonder which of us it wants, me or the flame. Every sound feels louder in the cold. My heartbeat, the hiss of burning sap, the soft crack of ice crawling up the doorframe. We live where the map forgets to draw itself, where survival is an act of defiance repeated daily. But then, picture another world. Far to the south, the air burns with light. There, a queen walks barefoot across marble floors that still remember the desert's breath. Her palace glows like the inside of a candle, its pillars carved from sandstone that hums when touched by sun. She doesn't need to fight for warmth, she rules it. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet, their survival depends on the same secret. I didn't know this then, of course. I was just a mother trying to keep her child alive, whispering to the fire as though it could hear me, stay, stay, stay. But warmth has a will of its own. You can hold it only so long before it demands to move on. That's what this story is about, the way warmth travels, the way it chooses. How it passes from hand to hand, from servant to queen, from forgotten village to empire of light. It's about what we do to keep it alive. Because centuries later, when the scholars in their bright rooms speak of civilization, of order, of reason, of invention, what they're really describing is this: the endless effort to stop the world from freezing over. Every city is a hearth, every law a shield against the night, and every story, including mine, begins with someone staring into the dark, clutching the last ember and whispering, "Not yet." If you listen closely, you can almost hear it now, that ancient hum beneath everything, the conversation between flame and frost. The stranger who came to Valmere understood it. The queen who walked across marble understood it too. They just gave it different names. One called it mercy, the other called it balance. Both were wrong, and both were right. So tonight, traveler, before we journey any further, take a breath. Feel the warmth in your chest. That pulse. That fragile heat, it's the same one that moved through the huts of the north, through the palaces of the south, through the bodies of mothers, servants, queens. It's the only thing we've ever truly shared. The rest, the power, the crowns, the rituals, are just ash pretending to be flame. But the secret? The secret is older than any kingdom. And it begins here, in this hut, with the sound of wind clawing at the walls, and the faint light of a stone that refuses to go out. Before the kings, before marble learned to echo footsteps, there was mud. Mud and muscle, breath and frost. My earliest memory of Valmere is not of faces but of smoke, its scent, its patience, the way it braided through rafters and decided who would live another season. Smoke was the alphabet of the living. It rose from every roof like a signature written to the gods. We're still here. The valley itself was a shallow bowl carved by glacial hands. The river that fed it ran slow and cold, a vein of silver among gray stone. In summer, it sang like water. In winter, it forgot how to move. Our homes huddled near its curve, small and round, their walls thick with straw and mud, their doors facing the morning as if greeting a reluctant friend. No one in Valmere owned glass. The world outside was framed by animal skin pulled tight across the window holes. Light arrived diffused, like a rumor. We measured time by labor, not clocks. Dawn meant tending. Dusk meant counting what survived. Children learned to carry before they learned to speak. Water, kindling, the smallest ember wrapped in wool for a neighbor whose hearth had gone sullen. That was our first economy, fire exchanged for trust. You could tell how wealthy a family was by how many burn scars marked their hands. I used to watch my mother at the hearth, her face lit by the orange pulse of necessity. She had a way of coaxing the flame that made it seem like conversation. She never struck flint angrily, she breathed near it, whispered, offered twigs the way one offers crumbs to birds. Patience, she'd say, is the first heat. The phrase stuck with me more than any sermon. Music, when it happened, belonged to work. The rhythm of chopping wood was a kind of percussion, the scrape of wool a melody. We didn't invent songs so much as notice them hiding in the effort. The elders said the frost listened, it spared those who pleased its ear. Maybe that's why even grief came with a tune. Our gods were few, our rules simpler still. Don't waste warmth, don't hoard, don't curse the wind, it carries news faster than feet. We believed the divine was mostly administrative, spirits that ensured seasons didn't forget their order. Elandra, goddess of warmth, was the only one who felt intimate. Her symbol was a spiral drawn in ash, sometimes on a wall, sometimes on skin. Each household kept its own version of her face, some carved, some imagined in smoke stains above the hearth. The priest of our village was less a preacher than a record keeper. His job was to note who had thanked the goddess properly, who had borrowed fire without returning it. But rules and reverence didn't make us noble. They made us consistent, which in Valmere was nobler than joy. Hardship was our dialect, predictability our luxury. Even the frost had manners. It came each year with enough warning to prepare the wood, fatten the goats, mend the roofs. Life was a slow negotiation with inevitability, and we were proud of how fair we thought the bargain was. There were games, of course. Children chased smoke rings through the streets, competing to see whose would last longest before breaking. Lovers carved initials into the soot of their doorframes. On rare clear nights, the valley would gather outside to watch the northern lights. The old women said those colors were the goddess's shawl, torn and mended endlessly. The young men said it was the sky remembering how to burn. Both might have been right. We didn't ask for certainty, it costs too much fuel. I was 14 the winter before the rules change. At that age, I thought knowledge meant endurance, that the more I learned about the seasons, the more power I would have over them. The elders encouraged it. Know your frost, they said, and it will respect you. So I studied. How to stack wood so it breathed, how to dry moss for kindling, how to bank coals under ash so they'd wake at dawn still warm. Every task had a rhythm, and the rhythm felt eternal. Our houses were small, but our patience was vast. The rhythm held us like a lullaby, a promise whispered through generations. Do this, and the cold will pass. We believed it the way one believes breath will follow breath. We built no monuments, only habits, because habits last longer. Sometimes I wonder if happiness was there and we didn't have the vocabulary for it. We didn't call it joy when the stew thickened just right, or when the wind changed direction before a storm. We called it luck, or timing, or grace. We smiled rarely, but when we did, the expression looked like a rediscovered language. There were no walls between neighbors, only the understanding that survival required choreography. When one roof collapsed under snow, the next 10 pairs of hands rebuilt it. No one called this kindness, it was accounting. A favor unreturned made you cold by association. The village ledger wasn't written in ink. It was carved into memory and repaid in labor. In such a system, loneliness was the worst poverty. We didn't fear death so much as randomness. The frost might claim you, but at least it followed rules. A fever, a slipped axe, a fire out of season, those were breaches of contract. For each anomaly, the priest added a line to his book of causes. Sometimes the explanations bordered on poetry. The child fell through ice because the moon envied her reflection. Poetry made the unbearable tolerable. Evenings were our truce with the day. When the last chores ended, people gathered in the meeting house, a long, low building that smelled of wool and smoke. There we shared what passed for stories, practical myths, moral weather reports. How a careless farmer lost his crop because he sneezed into the wind without apology. How a widow coaxed the sun to rise by singing through a snowstorm. Each tale disguised a rule, and each rule disguised fear. We told them not to entertain but to remember. Sometimes travelers passed through, bringing spices, salt, and rumors of the south. They spoke of deserts so hot that people slept on roofs to escape the ground's breath. We laughed, not cruelly but disbelievingly. To live in such fire seemed as absurd as breathing underwater. Yet something in me, even then, was curious. A world where heat was abundant must have its own rituals of gratitude or of guilt. In Valmere, we believed cold made us moral. Warmth was suspicious, a sign of indulgence. Too much comfort softens the bones, the elders warned. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps comfort is a kind of amnesia. But hardship breeds its own blindness. We grew so proud of our endurance that we mistook it for virtue. And so the days turned. The river froze, thawed, froze again. Babies were born. Old men joined the frost. Life repeated with the precision of a well-tended flame. I remember thinking how lucky we were to live in a world that kept its promises. Then came the winter that did not wait its turn. The first sign was subtle. Frost on the riverbank 2 weeks too early. A chill that refused to leave even under noon sun. We noticed, joked, then ignored it. Every pattern begins to break long before anyone admits it's breaking. We trusted the rhythm too deeply to imagine silence. On the last night before everything changed, the sky was startlingly clear. I remember standing outside, breath clouding in the air, watching stars so sharp they looked newly forged. The moonlight painted our roofs in silver, and every chimney still smoked. It was perfect. Perfect the way calm is perfect before the avalanche remembers gravity. I told myself the frost's mercy would hold. That tomorrow would come as it always had, predictable, survivable. But even as I banked the coals, a part of me, a small, traitorous ember, it began with silence. Not the gentle kind that follows snowfall, but a silence that felt manufactured, too complete. Like the world had swallowed its own breath. The wind stopped visiting, the birds forgot their names, even the river ceased its murmuring. In Valmere, stillness was an omen. We told ourselves it was nothing, that the frost was only early, that we had survived worse. But beneath our reassurance, something restless coiled. The first true warning came when the river froze before harvest's end. The water locked in mid-motion, a sheet of silver swallowing the nets and the fish with them. The men stared at it as if it had committed blasphemy. "It's only a cold snap," someone muttered, but no one answered. When we tried to break the ice, it resisted like stone. The frost had teeth. Then came the food spoilage. Grain that had survived the last frost turned soft and gray. Root cellars filled with the sweet, sick smell of rot. Smoke from our chimneys thickened, blackening the sky for a week before vanishing entirely. It wasn't that we stopped burning wood, it was that the wood stopped responding. We fed the hearths, but the flames lost interest. They flickered like tired hearts and went out mid-sigh. Families huddled together for warmth. We pressed our bodies against one another, layering ourselves like blankets, whispering prayers to Elandra, goddess of warmth. It was less religion than desperation. My mother taught me that prayer works best when the voice trembles. The gods prefer sincerity to eloquence. Our prayers that winter were nothing but tremors. Children stopped playing. Frost crept through window frames, tracing veins of white across the glass. Bread froze inside ovens. I remember one night when I woke to the sound of wood splitting, the support beam above my bed cracking from cold. I thought it was thunder. When morning came, the house looked as though it had aged a century overnight. We held council after council, though each one ended the same way, with the priest reciting the old rites and everyone pretending to believe him. "The goddess tests her children," he said, his breath fogging before his lips. "Those who endure will inherit her favor." But the goddess, if she was listening, offered no sign. That was when the stranger appeared. He came from the northern ridge, where no one traveled in winter. Cloaked in gray, his face hidden by a hood, he carried no pack, no tools, no horse. Just a small pouch hanging from a cord around his neck. I saw him first because my house stood closest to the road. His steps made no sound on the snow. When he passed, the air rippled, and for a moment, the frost on the doorframe softened, dripping as if in recognition. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. By the time I opened the door, he was already standing by the central hearth, studying the cold ash as though reading a book. "It sleeps," he said, his voice low, almost curious. "We can't wake it," I told him. He reached into his pouch and withdrew a handful of dust, blue as glacier light, shimmering like ground sapphires. The room dimmed around it. He scattered the dust over the ash, murmured something that sounded less like a word and more like breathing reversed. The effect was immediate. A spark leapt from nowhere, caught, and in an instant the hearth roared to life. The fire burned not orange but deep gold shot with blue veins, the color of forgiveness. The heat struck my face like memory. My mother gasped, dropping to her knees. I wanted to speak, to ask who he was, but my throat refused. The stranger turned to me, and I saw his eyes for the first time, two faint embers, steady and without reflection. "Keep what you kindle," he said. Then he left. By dawn, he was gone. Only his footprints remained, stretching northward until they melted into mist. We told ourselves he was a wanderer, a trick of luck. But the next night, the fire still burned, stronger than ever. When my mother shared embers with our neighbors, their fires, too, leapt awake. The warmth spread like contagion. Chimneys that had been dead for weeks began to breathe smoke again. The frost retreated to the edges of the valley. The priest called it a miracle. He claimed Elandra had sent her messenger. Others whispered of witchcraft. But in the quiet between their arguments, I heard something else. The faint hum of the flame, a sound just beneath hearing. It wasn't crackling or hissing, it was whispering, like a language trying to translate itself through heat. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without shivering. But even as I drifted off, I felt uneasy. Fire was never free. Every blessing had a ledger. In the days that followed, the village changed. People walked straighter. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then louder. The stranger became myth before the week was out. Some said he was Elandra herself in disguise. Others said he was the last survivor of a forgotten tribe who'd mastered warmth. Children left offerings near the old shrine. Bowls of melted snow, bits of cloth, the first sprigs of thawed moss. The frost, insulted or appeased, withdrew. Yet small oddities remained. The fires burned longer than they should. Logs that should have lasted an hour glowed through the night. And when they did finally die, the ashes stayed warm to the touch. Some claimed they saw faint blue sparks even in daylight, dancing at the corners of their vision. I remember kneeling beside the hearth, pressing my palm near the coals. The heat pulsed softly, like breathing. I thought of the stranger's words. "Keep what you kindle." It sounded simple, but something in his tone suggested warning, not instruction. Soon, our gratitude became ritual. The priest ordered that each household bring a handful of ash to the central square at the full moon, to return a portion of Elandra's gift. We obeyed. We mixed our ashes together in a great clay basin, stirring them until they shimmered faintly blue. When the priest scattered the mixture to the wind, a wave of warmth rolled through the crowd. Children giggled, women wept. Even the frost on the roofs seemed to hesitate. That was the night we began to believe we were chosen. After the ceremony, people carried bits of the mixed ash home, sealing them in jars or pressing them into pendants. The priest encouraged it, a token of the goddess's favor, he said. But I noticed something else. When two people with ash tokens stood close, the air between them grew warmer. It was subtle but real. Proximity had become power. The old boundaries began to shift. Families who had once lived on the edge of the village moved inward, closer to the communal fire. Those who arrived late found themselves colder, more dependent on their neighbors' charity. Soon, arguments began over whose embers were purest, whose tokens glowed brightest. We told ourselves it was healthy competition, a way to honor the goddess. In truth, it was the beginning of hierarchy. And still, the frost waited outside the valley, patient as a creditor. The world had changed, but it hadn't forgiven. One night, I dreamed of the stranger again. He stood at the edge of the hearth, his cloak stirring though there was no wind. His eyes glowed softer now, almost sorrowful. "You've mistaken the gift," he said. "It was never meant to be owned." When I woke, the fire burned higher than ever, blue and gold licking the rafters. I reached for the poker, but before I touched it, the flame bent toward me, as if listening. The hum was louder now, almost words. Outside, snow began to fall again. Thick, deliberate. The frost had returned to collect its debt. New. The air felt too still. The cold, too clean. Something vast and unseen had already shifted, and the world we thought we understood was inhaling before its long, irreversible exhale. In the beginning, the ritual was small, half faith, half fear. Every household buried a handful of glowing embers beneath ash before sleeping, so that by dawn, a soft red pulse waited under the gray. The first breath of morning would stir it back to life. We called this act keeping the heart warm. It was practical, nothing more. Until the priests decided to give it a name. They called it Elandra's covenant. And once a thing is named, it stops belonging to those who invented it. The covenant required order. The Council of Elders appointed certain families to oversee the exchange of embers between houses. They were chosen for their steadiness, their long lineage, and, in truth, their proximity to the priest's hearth. The rest of us called them ashkeepers. They carried woven satchels lined with fur, designed to hold warm stones and coal wrapped in cloth. Each morning, they walked from house to house, checking fires, trading heat, measuring loyalty by temperature. At first, the duty felt sacred. People left bread and broth for the keepers, blessing their steps. But reverence, like flame, always hungers for structure. Within a month, the keepers began recording whose embers burned strongest, whose faded too fast. They kept ledgers of warmth, marking each household with symbols, spirals for devotion, slashes for negligence. Fire had become an audit. The council said it was necessary. A flame cannot survive without discipline, they told us. Carelessness offends the goddess. So they taught new practices. The breath pattern of warmth, in through the nose, out through the heart. We performed it before rekindling each morning, believing that the heat in our chests could instruct the fire how to live. The children learned it before their own names, their little lungs expanding in rhythm with the smoke. It should have remained ritual, a simple bond between people and element. But superstition evolves the way mold does, quietly, in corners. One winter later, the ashkeepers announced that the strength of a family's flame reflected its moral state. Pure hearts burn hotter, they said. The cold begins inside. And because no one wanted to be accused of inner frost, we stoked our hearths until the air itself quivered. A competition began, polite at first. Neighbors compared the glow of their chimneys, boasted of coals that could boil a kettle without wood. But pride breeds scarcity. Those who couldn't keep pace grew ashamed. Children whispered that families whose fires dimmed too early had offended Elandra. The keepers kept visiting, always smiling, always writing in their books. Soon, fire became currency. When a household's flame failed entirely, they were forced to beg a coal from others. That coal was called mercy ember, and it came with obligation. The recipient owed labor, splitting logs, weaving baskets, sewing repairs. Sharing warmth strengthens the village, the priests preached. But warmth, we learned, gathers power around those who control its flow. My mother, Mira, resisted quietly. She said the goddess needed no accountants. Fire listens to gratitude, not hierarchy, she told them when they came to inspect her hearth. They wrote her name down anyway. She smiled, though I saw her hand tremble. By the next winter, the covenant had expanded. We now observed the threefold keeping: hearth, body, and community. The hearth had to burn nightly. The body had to perform the breath ritual at dawn and dusk. The community had to offer a portion of its ash to the central pit each full moon. The priests claimed that the mixed ash retained divine memory. When scattered to the wind, it would call Elandra's favor for another month. The ritual was mesmerizing. Hundreds gathered in the square, cloaked in gray and white, carrying bowls of ash that glowed faintly blue. The air trembled with heat and devotion. At the signal, the High Keeper lifted his staff and began the chant. One by one, we exhaled toward the pit, reciting the ancient rhythm, in through the nose, out through the heart. The smoke rose like a single creature, swirling toward the sky before vanishing into the stars. The wind that followed was warm for days. But warmth with witnesses becomes spectacle. And spectacle demands control. The keepers began assigning roles: coal mothers to guard the embers during childbirth, flame sons to oversee funerals and ensure the dead's heat returned properly to the earth. Even marriage required a ritual fire test. 2 candles joined, their flames mingling. If they burned steady, the union was blessed. If one wavered, the match was postponed. I remember a girl named Dahlin who cried for weeks after her candle bent away from her beloveds. The priest told her it meant the goddess desired her elsewhere. Dahlin drowned herself in the river 3 nights later. The current froze around her like glass. We buried her under snow and told ourselves it was mercy. The system hardened year by year. The keepers wore new robes embroidered with gold threads shaped like tongues of flame. Their homes grew larger, their hearths higher. They claimed the height helped the smoke reach Elandra faster. When frost struck the outer farms, the keepers instructed villagers to relocate closer to the central square, to share heat more efficiently. Those who refused were branded cold souls and denied ember aid. By then, faith had become policy. To question warmth was to question survival. And survival, in Valmere, was the only virtue that mattered. But beneath the discipline, a strange tenderness lingered. Despite the rules, we still shared stories beside our hearths. Parents taught children to listen to the size of firewood, to predict weather by how the flame leaned. Some said the blue flicker at the base of the coals was the goddess's heartbeat. Others said it was the echo of the stranger's dust. I preferred the second story. Gods punish, ghosts teach. In the long nights, the keepers visited each house to ensure compliance. They carried bronze rods tipped with crystal that glowed faintly when placed near a living fire. The brighter it shone, the purer your devotion. I remember one inspection vividly. Our hearth burned steady, but the crystal only shimmered weakly. The keeper frowned. "You breathe too shallow," he said. "The goddess hears the strength of lungs." My mother bowed and said nothing. That night, she made me practice the breath pattern until dawn, whispering, "They listen for rhythm, not truth." Somewhere between fear and faith, Valmere became efficient. No hearth ever failed again. The valley glowed through storms that swallowed other towns whole. Travelers spoke of seeing our lights from 10 leagues away, a constellation on earth. We were proud of our endurance. We called ourselves the warm-blooded. Historians later would praise our ingenuity. They'd call it the earliest form of thermal governance, a communal method for conserving energy in harsh climates. But history forgets how systems feel from inside. The keepers were not engineers, they were gatekeepers of comfort. And comfort, rationed, becomes obedience. Still, I cannot pretend the covenant didn't save us. Without it, the frost would have erased Valmere. Every rule, however cruel, was born from one reasonable fear: that the warmth could leave. We had seen the dark that waited beyond the valley. We would do anything not to return to it. And so we carried on, perfecting our rituals until belief turned mechanical. Every gesture rehearsed, every breath timed. We mistook repetition for reverence. We mistook heat for harmony. We mistook survival for grace. When the priests began whispering of expansion, of carrying Elandra's light to other lands, I should have recognized the pattern. Systems that promise salvation always grow hungry. But I was young, and the fire still felt holy. It would take years and exile to understand that the moment we began measuring warmth, we stopped feeling it. Among all who served the covenant, one woman carried its promise and its doubt in equal measure. My mother, Mira, the healer of Valmere. People said she was chosen by Elandra herself, that her hands could coax fire from wet wood, that she could warm the dying just by touching their temples. I remember her differently, not as a saint or a legend, but as a woman who smelled of smoke and herbs, whose voice always balanced between tenderness and exhaustion. She was one of the first ash keepers. The council trusted her because she never lied, and because she didn't need to. Fire obeyed her without question. I watched her countless nights as she moved through our hut. Hair lit orange by the hearth, palms blackened with soot. The flame bent toward her like a child reaching for its mother. She never used the language of the priests. Her prayers were quieter, private things whispered not to gods but to the ember itself. "Stay," she would murmur. "Stay until they wake." People came to her door at all hours. A mother whose infant shivered blue. A farmer whose hands cracked from frostbite. A widow who swore she'd heard her late husband's breath in the fire. Mira welcomed them all. She treated burns, frost wounds, and grief with the same tools: poultices, hot stones, patience. She never accepted payment except stories. "Stories feed the flame," she'd say. And maybe they did, because her hearth never went out. When the covenant began hardening into rule, she resisted. She argued with the High Keeper, saying the goddess needed no taxes, no hierarchy. "Warmth isn't obedience," she told him during one winter council. "It's mercy." He replied, "Mercy requires order." They stood facing each other in the temple square, breath visible in the freezing air. To everyone else, it looked like a duel fought with fog. That night, the keepers stopped visiting our house. Officially, it was because our fire was always strong. Unofficially, it was because she'd become inconvenient. But isolation was never silence. People still came to her in secret, seeking help when the priest's rituals failed. She cured frost fever with crushed pine sap and boiled ash, a method the council called heresy until they began copying it. They called her the Ash Whisperer, sometimes with awe, sometimes with accusation. When I was born, she wrapped me in wool warmed by the hearth and pressed a small stone, glowing faintly red, against my chest. "Elandra's breath," she said. I was too young to remember it, but she told me later how the light from that stone pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. "You were never afraid of the cold," she liked to say. "Even the frost knew better than to touch you." I grew up among the tools of her trade: bundles of dried moss hanging from beams, jars filled with amber liquid, the soft hiss of boiling mixtures that smelled of earth and smoke. She taught me the language of warmth, how to read the way heat moved across a room, how to feel the temperature of a fever without a hand. She believed the body mirrored the hearth. When one faltered, the other dimmed. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wake to find her sitting by the coals, scribbling notes on scraps of bark. "What are you writing?" I'd ask. "A map," she'd reply, "of things that can't be seen." She meant the patterns of breath and heat, the invisible routes of survival that passed between people. I didn't understand then that she was recording more than remedies. She was trying to preserve freedom itself, warmth ungoverned. But the covenant had little patience for scholars who didn't cite its scripture. The High Keeper began to warn her publicly. "Too much curiosity leads to cold," he said during a sermon. "Even the brightest flame can consume itself." Mira only smiled. "So can control," she answered. It was that smile that doomed her. The year the frost returned heavier than ever, she spent every waking hour helping the villagers rebuild their hearths. The fires sputtered, starved of air. "The ash has lost its memory," she muttered. She mixed her own remedy, a powder of salt and crushed emberstone, something she said would teach the coals to breathe again. The keepers called it blasphemy. "Only Elandra grants renewal," they said. Mira ignored them. She saved dozens of lives that winter, though she didn't call it saving, she called it fairness. Then, on the longest night of the year, our hut caught fire. I remember the roar before the heat. It sounded like the sky tearing open. The smoke was too thick to see, too fast to think. My mother pushed me through the back door, shoving a warm stone into my hand. "Run," she said. "Keep what I've kindled." Her eyes looked like the stranger's had, years before, calm, bright, resigned. I stumbled into the snow, clutching that small glow as the roof caved in. The villagers arrived too late. They tried to douse the flames with buckets of ice, but the fire didn't behave like normal fire. It burned blue, steady, silent. By morning, only ash remained. No bones, no tools, just a single circle of warmth radiating from where the hearth had been. The snow melted in a perfect rain. The priest declared it divine reclamation. "The goddess has taken back her servant," he announced. People nodded. No one cried. Publicly, Mira became legend, a martyr of flame. Privately, whispers began. Some said she had defied Elandra, that the fire had consumed her arrogance. Others said she'd become one with it, a spirit walking the wind. I was too young to argue. I only knew that warmth no longer comforted me. Every fire looked hungry. After her death, the keepers came to collect her notes. They claimed it was to preserve her wisdom for the archives, but I watched them burn the papers in the temple courtyard. "Her words are unstable," one said. "They could reignite doubt." I wanted to scream, but my throat stayed frozen. I learned that grief burns slower than wood. That same week, traders from the south passed through Valmere. They were desert people, their skin the color of sun-baked earth, their cloaks smelling faintly of spice and heat. They spoke a language none of us understood, but when they saw the pendant I wore, my mother's stone, they bowed their heads. One woman touched it reverently. "Maris," she whispered, "keeper of balance." They offered to take me with them, to a place called Saethem, far beyond the mountains, where warmth was not rationed but worshipped. The council agreed too quickly. Perhaps they thought sending me away would quiet the memory of my mother. Perhaps they feared what would happen if I stayed. I remember looking back one last time at Valmere, the chimneys breathing pale smoke into the morning air. The whole valley looked like a lung exhaling fatigue. The journey south felt like traveling through seasons of memory. The frost thinned. The wind lost its bite. The air began to taste of dust instead of ice. I kept my mother's stone hidden beneath my clothes, though it had cooled by then. Some nights, when the stars shimmered above the dunes, I held it in my palm and swore I could feel a heartbeat. I was 12 when we reached Saethem. The city rose from the desert like a mirage, solidified, golden walls, wide steps, palm trees whispering in heat. I had never seen so much color, nor so much stillness. The air shimmered, and the people moved as if they were part of the sunlight. To me, it felt both alien and familiar. I understood frost. I did not yet understand fire. The traders sold goods, exchanged words, then left me with the servants of the palace. I was given a simple robe, a cot, and a task: to clean the marble halls where the queen walked barefoot, her ankles ringed with bells that sang even in silence. My mother's teachings, patience, observation, the rhythm of breath, became my survival tools. Servants who listen live longer than those who speak. At night, when the desert cooled and the palace lamps flickered, I would kneel by the flame of the smallest lantern, repeating the breath pattern my mother taught me. In through the nose, out through the heart. The flame would quiver, just slightly, as if remembering her voice. In Saethem, warmth was abundance. But I had already learned that abundance is just another form of danger. Saethem was another universe. One made of light that did not ask permission to shine. I still remember my first morning there. The air trembled with heat even before the sun cleared the horizon. The sand outside the palace walls glittered like crushed glass, and everything, stone, cloth, skin, carried the memory of flame. The palace itself was a miracle of architecture and arrogance. Its halls were built to worship heat, wide arches to channel wind, marble floors cool enough to walk barefoot, golden lattices casting patterned shadows like woven fire. The servants moved silently through it, wearing linen so fine it whispered when they passed. In Valmere, warmth was an effort. Here it was effortless, omnipresent, almost indulgent. I was a curiosity to them. The girl from the north with gray eyes and a pendant of dead stone. They called me Ash Child, half mockery, half fascination. At first, I thought they pitied me. Later, I realized pity is simply another kind of attention, and attention was power. The first lesson of Saethem was observation. Servants who noticed survived. Servants who assumed disappeared. I learned to watch how the nobles measured each gesture, how they spoke in riddles that balanced compliment and command. Words here were tools of temperature, they could scorch or soothe. I learned quickly. The queen, Saethem, ruled from a dais of white marble polished to reflection. She was not old, but she carried age like an ornament, an assurance that time itself bowed to her. Her skin gleamed with oils that smelled faintly of cedar and myrrh. When she walked, the air bent slightly around her, as if even heat paused to listen. I saw her for the first time in the reflection of the floor. She passed so near I could count the rings on her toes, each carved with the symbol of a flame. I remember thinking that she looked like a moving sun, and that everyone else merely orbited. It was not long before she noticed me. One evening, I was cleaning the library, a cavern of scrolls and dust where air itself seemed older than memory. The torches burned with a strange, steady blue, fueled by some southern resin that produced no smoke. I had no right to read, but curiosity is a kind of hunger that feeds on itself. I unrolled a scroll at random. Its writing was unlike any I had seen, elegant, spiraling letters describing the laws of heat and shadow, the harmony between fire and sand. I didn't hear the queen enter. Her voice startled me. Soft, measured, almost amused. "You can read that?" I froze. "Some," I admitted. "The symbols speak like the old tongue of Valmere." She approached, her shadow falling over the parchment. "Valmere," she repeated, "a kingdom of frost and silence. They pray to the goddess of warmth, do they not?" "Yes, your grace," I said, unsure whether to bow or burn. Her eyes lingered on my pendant, dull and dark against my skin. "And yet you carry no heat." I wanted to answer, but the words tangled. She smiled, kindly, I thought then, though I would later learn her kindness was often a form of curiosity. "Keep it," she said. "A relic of balance. Perhaps that is why you were sent here." That was how it began. A queen's fascination with a servant's accent. In the weeks that followed, she summoned me often. At first to fetch scrolls, then to read them aloud. Her scholars, all men, watched in uneasy silence as I translated fragments of the northern tongue. The queen listened with an attentiveness that felt dangerous. "Your people," she said once, "sought warmth in fear. We seek it in mastery." In Saethem, fire was not divine, it was empirical. The priests of the sun were scientists in robes, charting the movement of heat through sand and glass. They had built mirrors so vast they could focus sunlight to melt stone. To them, warmth was a force to be harvested, contained, and sold. Every temple doubled as a laboratory, every prayer an experiment. Yet amid this brilliance, I sensed a hollowness. The people of Saethem did not understand mercy. Their fires burned for spectacle, not survival. They feared cold as weakness but forgot that too much heat can also kill. The queen, however, was different. She sought balance. She once told me, "Power that consumes is no power at all. A ruler must learn to cool her own fire." Her words reminded me of my mother. Perhaps that's why I began to trust her. Months passed. My duties grew. I managed scrolls, then correspondence, then counsel. The other servants whispered that the queen had taken me as her shadow. I began to see patterns in her rule, the subtle ways she tempered excess, the silent revolutions disguised as etiquette. She taxed salt instead of water, forcing nobles to value preservation over indulgence. She decreed that the palace hearths burn low during droughts, so that the people might remember the luxury of flame. Through her, I learned that control could masquerade as compassion. It was in the royal library that I discovered the writings of the servant queens of Maris. Their stories had been erased from official chronicles, but fragments remained, accounts of women who ruled not by decree but by understanding. They governed through equilibrium, balancing the harshness of the sun with the cool patience of night. Their symbol was the divided circle, half flame, half wave. I showed the queen my findings. She smiled faintly, tracing the emblem with her finger. Maris, she said, almost to herself. They ruled by listening, and we destroyed them for it. That night, she ordered the library sealed. Only she and I were allowed within. She asked me to translate the fragments fully, to reconstruct the lost teachings of Maris. If knowledge once brought ruin, she said, perhaps it can now bring repair. So I worked, days into nights, copying, cross-referencing, breathing the dust of centuries. I began to dream in the language of Maris. Words that carried temperature as meaning. I wrote of cycles, of breath and heat, of the covenant between opposites. The queen read everything. Sometimes she would ask me to read aloud while she closed her eyes, listening as though to music. Rumors spread. The priests grew uneasy. They called our work, resurrection of heresy. But the queen dismissed them. Fear, she said, is the frost of the mind. Let it melt. She began to speak differently, rule differently. Edicts softened. The markets opened to commoners. Servants were permitted to keep personal hearths. For the first time, I saw warmth shared without hierarchy. It felt like Valmere before the keepers, briefly, achingly fair. But power, like fire, resists containment. The court grew restless. The nobles whispered that a servants' council had bewitched their queen. The priests preached that old northern ghosts had returned to tempt the sun. I ignored them. I thought knowledge could protect us. I thought reason could quiet fear. One evening, as the last light bled from the horizon, the queen stood beside me at the balcony overlooking the desert. The sand rippled like liquid gold. If we fail, she said softly, remember this. Warmth is not a weapon. It is a language. The moment we use it to command, it forgets how to speak. Her words felt like prophecy. That night, I dreamed of my mother's hut, its walls breathing smoke, the stranger's voice echoing through the embers. Keep what you kindle. I woke to find the queen's chambers glowing faintly blue, her hearth burning with the color of Valmere's fire. She smiled at me in the half-light. Perhaps, she said, the north and south were never meant to be divided. And in that moment, with the desert wind sighing through the open lattice, I believed her. I believed that warmth could be shared without cost. I believed we had rewritten the covenant. I was wrong, for even as our fires burned in harmony, the frost had already begun to gather again, this time, not in the weather, but in the hearts of men who feared what they could not measure. Every system begins as a prayer and ends as a ledger. In Valmere, the ashkeepers learned that lesson by accident. In Saethem, we repeated it by design. For a time, the queen's reforms shone like sunrise. The city prospered, its markets overflowing with spice, its fountains singing to the wind. We had built a rhythm that felt new. Scholars debating beside beggars, servants reading aloud to their masters, the scent of incense mingling with laughter. I should have known that harmony this loud was unsustainable. Balance invites envy. It began as whispers, priests muttering that the queen's light had grown strange, too pale, too northern. Courtiers watching me from behind jeweled veils, their smiles polite, their eyes calculating. The queen's new policies had cut too deeply, temples taxed, rituals simplified. The royal treasury used to build public bathhouses where even peasants could wash in heated water. Blasphemy, the priests called it. The divine warmth belongs to the chosen. But the queen ignored them. She trusted the evidence of comfort. She said, if people are clean, they will not fear their own touch. She spoke like my mother sometimes, calm, relentless. I began to fear for her the way children fear storms, admiring and powerless. The real fracture came when King Arian returned from the Western Front. He was a man built for conquest, not reflection. While the queen ruled with equilibrium, he preferred edges. They had once shared the throne, but absence changes geometry, one circle becomes two. He found his court transformed and his wife confiding in a servant who spoke of balance between fire and frost. At first, he tolerated me. He called me, the scholar of warmth, half jest, half warning. But his patience thinned when the priests brought him reports of our studies, the reconstructed writings of the servant queens of Maris, the diagrams of breath and temperature, the scrolls written in 2 languages. To him, it all smelled of rebellion dressed as philosophy. A cult of ashes, he called it. You would turn my kingdom into smoke. The queen stood beside me before the council, her hands steady on the railing. Knowledge cannot be heresy, she said. Only fear can, but fear breeds faster than reason. The priests accused me of resurrecting the forbidden rites of Maris, a religion that had once taught that every life contained both fire and frost. They claimed such balance defied the will of the sun, who gave Saethem its power. The servant from Valmere brings frost to our bones, they warned. She cools the queen's heart. Rumors spread faster than sand in wind. They said I burned incense laced with human ash to speak with the dead. They said the queen's new bathhouses were altars to a buried goddess. They said I carried in my chest a stone that glowed under moonlight. That last one, at least, was partly true. One morning, the guards entered my chamber without knocking. They tore through my scrolls, scattering years of work into the dust. The parchment that fell open last was my mother's, her notes on breath and healing, smuggled across 2 empires. The captain lifted it like a confession. Witchcraft, he said simply. I was dragged through the corridors I had once polished, past servants who lowered their eyes and nobles who pretended not to recognize me. The queen tried to intervene, but Arian's hand on her shoulder stopped her. She will be questioned, he said. If her words are true, they will survive the fire. They built the trial as spectacle. 1,000 citizens gathered in the square. The priests surrounded me, their robes gold and heavy, their mouths full of righteousness. They read the charges: treason, heresy, corruption of royal virtue. The queen was forbidden to speak. She stood behind a screen of woven bronze, her face half visible, half reflected. Do you deny bringing foreign gods into Saethem? The high priest demanded. I brought no gods, I said. Only a memory of how warmth was once shared. He raised a finger. You claim divinity lies in balance? In understanding, I replied. Fire dies without air. Air freezes without fire. The crowd murmured. He leaned forward. And who decides that balance? Those who live in it. Gasps rippled through the assembly. The king's voice cut through them like metal. Then you claim the people are gods. No, I said softly. Only responsible. He smiled, the kind of smile that ends conversations. Then you were dangerous. They tore the pendant from my neck. The stone clattered on the marble floor, flickering once, faintly blue, before going dark. I expected the queen to look away. Instead, she met my eyes through the lattice. No words passed between us, but I understood. Regret is just another form of heat. That night, she came to my cell. The guards pretended not to see. She carried a lantern, its light trembling like a secret. You should have fled, she whispered. Would you have? No, she said, and smiled sadly. That's why they fear us. I told her not to blame herself. She pressed her hand to the bars. The fire you brought was never yours to control, she said. Nor mine to protect. The next morning, I stood before the council one last time. The high priest asked if I had any final words. I remember looking up at the dome above us, sunlight pouring through the stained glass in waves of amber and blue. The 2 colors met at my feet. Fire, I said, does not ask who it warms. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the priests hesitated. By dawn, my chamber was empty. The guards claimed I had vanished. Some said the queen arranged my escape, smuggling me through the catacombs beneath the palace. Others swore they saw smoke rising from my window, tinged faintly blue. The official record said nothing. The queen was forced to abdicate soon after. The priests called it purification, the king called it mercy. She withdrew to the desert shrine of Maris, where the wind sculpted ruins into ghosts. No one saw her again. The temples reopened. The fires burned gold once more, obedient and predictable. My name was struck from the archives. The scrolls we wrote were sealed in vaults labeled hazardous knowledge. The bathhouses closed. The poor returned to washing in dust. Order restored, they said. Balance re-established. But the nights grew colder, even in the heart of Saethem. And yet, every few months, someone would report a strange occurrence. A lamp that burned without oil. A hearth that glowed blue and refused to die. A servant who breathed upon cold stone and saw it blush with heat. The priests called them lies. The people called them echoes. Years later, when the city finally fell to drought, the archives burned. The priests blamed the wind, but some swore they heard laughter in the flames, soft, familiar, northern. They buried the ashes under glass, building a new temple atop them. And beneath that temple, sealed between layers of forgotten history, lay a single inscription carved in two tongues. In through the nose, out through the heart. They never understood it was a warning, not a prayer. Centuries later, time finally cooled what memory could not. Saethem sank beneath its own dunes, its marble eaten by sand, its language eroded into whispers. The story of the queen and her northern servant became myth, then metaphor, then nothing. The wind kept the secret better than any priest ever could. Until 2023, I was part of the team that rediscovered it. A handful of archaeologists from Alexandria University, a few tired volunteers, and me, the translator who still carried a stone around her neck. It wasn't blue, only chipped quartz I'd found as a child, but I liked the weight. It reminded me of warmth pretending to be cold. We were digging north of Siwa, where the desert folds like paper. Satellite scans had hinted at geometric anomalies buried beneath the dunes. On our third week, a storm ripped through camp, flaying the sand from the ridge and revealing what looked like steps. Beneath those steps, we found a chamber, walls of black stone veined with gold, ceiling collapsed but air still sweet. On one slab lay an urn, its lid carved with two spirals intertwining, one flame, one wave. Inside were scroll fragments, thin, brittle, impossible. One line caught the light, in through the nose, out through the heart. Two languages, one northern, one desert. At first, we thought it coincidence. Scripts overlap, cultures borrow. But when we compared the handwriting to known samples from Saethem's royal archive, the match was undeniable. It belonged to Liana of Valmere, the servant who became Queen's shadow, the woman erased. The scroll wasn't just a prayer. It described a theory of heat exchange between body and air, a kind of proto-thermodynamics laced with ritual language. The scientists laughed at the poetry, but I couldn't. It read like memory wearing a lab coat. Night in the desert is colder than you imagine. While the others slept, I stayed in the chamber, tracing the grooves of the spirals. My breath fogged, then vanished. For a moment, I thought I heard faint humming, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. I told myself it was wind. Still, I pressed my palm to the stone. It was warm. When the news broke, universities scrambled. A lost civilization of dual heat cultures. The headlines shouted discovery, the world heard mystery. Museums wanted relics, not meaning. Within weeks, the urn and fragments were shipped to Cairo, sealed behind glass. But I kept one scrap of parchment in my notebook. The smallest, the least legible, the one everyone dismissed. Under magnification, I noticed faint new marks, etched by someone centuries later. Keep what you kindle. I stared at it until the letters blurred. My reflection in the lab glass looked wrong, too pale, too distant. I turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow from the emergency strip. The parchment shimmered faintly blue, as if remembering. We like to think warmth is conquered now. We have radiators, engines, networks pulsing with invisible heat. But every system we build still worships the same logic. Keep it burning, keep it moving, never let it die. Our cities are new hearths, our wires, new embers. And beneath it all, the same ancient fear, cold as consequence, waiting. Sometimes, when the power hums through my apartment, I think of Valmere's huts and Saethem's towers, both gone to dust but still echoing in the circuitry. Fire turned to electricity, ash to data. And yet, it's the same heartbeat. We've only changed its accent. One evening, I brought the parchment home. I set it beside a candle and breathed, in through the nose, out through the heart. The flame bent toward me, blue at its base. I smiled, half at myself, half at the memory of all those who tried to measure the unmeasurable. Strange, isn't it? How stories of fire and frost outlast even empires. How every civilization survives on borrowed warmth. So tonight, as your room settles into quiet and the soft machinery of modern life hums around you, imagine that tiny ember again. The one passed from hand to hand, from frost to flame, from servant to queen. It's older than story, older than faith, and it still burns somewhere between your ribs. I like to think of Liana sometimes, not as a saint, but as a translator between worlds. She understood what her priests and kings could not. That warmth is not ownership, it's communion. When she said fire does not ask who it warms, she wasn't offering comfort. She was issuing a warning. The moment we use warmth to separate ourselves from others, it begins to fade. The archaeologists who unearthed her name will catalog it under myth, file it between pottery shards and carbon samples. But stories refuse confinement. They move like heat through walls. Maybe, centuries from now, someone else will find our remains, broken machines, glass towers half buried, and call them temples of warmth. Maybe they'll think we prayed to the hum of electricity, and maybe they won't be wrong. When I shut my eyes, I still see the two worlds breathing in unison. The hut in Valmere, walls trembling under wind. The palace of Saethem, marble glowing with sun. Between them, the same gesture. A hand cupped around a fragile flame, protecting, not owning. That's the secret of all endurance, to guard without grasping. If you listen carefully, you can still hear them. The murmur of frost and the sigh of fire, meeting in the air between heartbeats. Theirs was never a battle. It was a dialogue, one that every age must relearn. Take a slow breath now. In through the nose, out through the heart. Feel how the air warms just slightly when it leaves you. That's the ancient covenant surviving inside your lungs. You are both queen and servant, keeper of warmth, guardian of balance. Let the lights fade. Let the room grow soft around the edges. Somewhere in the distance, an old hearth hums. Somewhere beneath your floor, the electric veins of the city carry heat through cables, quiet as prayer. All of it is the same story, retold in different tongues. When this story ends, don't rush to fill the silence. Let it linger. The hush that follows is the sound of connection cooling, not disappearing. Even silence, handled gently, gives back a little warmth. Fire does not ask who it warms. It only asks to be remembered.